Hello, everyone. I'm David Quinn. I'm a professor of K-12 education policy at the University of Southern California Rossier School of Education in the US. And in this presentation, I'll be sharing results from a set of experiments I've led on how the way in which we frame racial inequality and educational outcomes by race can affect people's racial stereotypes and the extent to which they prioritize these inequalities as a policy issue. As I'll discuss, using data on inequality in educational outcomes by race can be a powerful component of a program to advance racial equity in education. At the same time, if used without proper care, presentations of data can have unintended negative consequences of perpetuating racial stereotypes. So as you'll see, this is not an argument that I'm making against using data to track between group differences in educational outcomes, but rather it's an argument for vigilance in proper framing of these data. Since this presentation is necessarily brief, I'll include the citations at the end for anyone who's interested for reading the full articles on the studies that I'll report here. So I'll begin with giving an overview of the takeaways of the studies that I'll present here. So the key takeaways I'll present is that when it comes to discourse on racial inequity in education, the framing and the presentation of racialized statistics matters. So I'll be presenting evidence that presenting racial differences in proficiency rates on standardized tests can magnify racial stereotypes. I'll also be presenting evidence that the language that we use to describe these inequalities matters. In particular, achievement gap language tends also to magnify stereotypes and lead people to place less priority on these inequalities. So this work is motivated by the fact that over the past several decades, the discourse on race in education in the United States and elsewhere has been dominated by what's been called the achievement gap discourse. So you've probably come across this kinds of discourse in policy discussions, in research, in education circles. It's also dominant in media, and I'll give just a few examples of some headlines from major media outlets in the US. So we have here, racial gap between white and black students still gaping. Education racial gap wide as ever, according to NAEP. And so this achievement gap discourse is the presentation of between race differences in things like test scores and graduation rates. And of course, the reason why we focus on these between race differences is that they reflect underlying injustices that must be redressed. So these differences in educational outcomes are due to historical racism and contemporary racism in its various forms. But at the same time, scholars have been increasingly concerned that the way in which this discourse frames inequality may have unintended negative consequences. And so in particular, Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's a main scholar in this area, has written that the achievement gap discourse, quote, constructs students as defective and lacking and admonishes them to catch up. So the concern is that by focusing on student outcomes, we're drawing people's attention to students, and we may be leading people to interpret these differences as the result of deficiencies in the students themselves, as opposed to the result of structural injustices that lead to these observed differences in educational outcomes by race. And so in doing that, the achievement gap discourse and presentation of between group differences in educational outcomes may serve to end up perpetuating negative racial stereotypes. More recently, Ibram Kendi, in his best-selling book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, has made a similar argument where he wrote, quote, "We degrade Black minds every time we speak of an achievement gap based on standardized tests." He continues, "There is an even more sinister implication in achievement gap talk, that disparities in academic achievement accurately reflect disparities in intelligence among racial groups." So the concern is that we live in a world that has these racial stereotypes. And when we present statistics on between group differences in educational outcomes, that can be misinterpreted as further evidence of these stereotypes and may serve to perpetuate negative stereotypes. So there's good reason to worry that this achievement gap discourse and achievement gap statistics may have some unintended negative consequences, but there until recently hadn't been any experimental evidence of the effects of these achievement gap discourses. And so I conducted a series of experiments to collect some evidence on this question. So in a set of 3 different web-based experiments, I examined the effects of reports of achievement gap statistics. And I used 3 short video clips that participants were randomly assigned to view. After watching their video clip, I administered a number of outcome measures, and I'll report those in a couple slides. The main condition of interest here was this achievement gap discourse condition, and it was a clip from a local TV news cast where the news reporters here were reporting on the results from a recent statewide achievement test for K-12 students. And they were emphasizing the racial differences in proficiency rates on the test. So I'll give you a sense of some of the content of the video here. The video opens with the newscaster saying, "Disappointing numbers out today show the wide achievement gap in Minnesota between white and minority students is not getting any smaller." Here, continuing with some further representative text. "Most disappointing is the failure to close the achievement gap. The goal was to trim it in half by next year. That's now a long shot. The gap between white and Black students is essentially unchanged." So that's the achievement gap discourse video. Other participants were randomly assigned to this counter stereotypical video, which was a similarly length clip from the charter school network Harlem Children's Zone in the US. And the clip featured Black students who were talking about what they loved about their school, their academic goals, what they want to be when they grow up, etc. That was the counter stereotypical video. And a final control condition was a group that was randomly assigned just to watch a Khan Academy tutorial on the Pythagorean theorem. So in this first experiment, I found that the achievement gap discourse video presenting those between race differences in proficiency rates increased implicit racial stereotyping by 22% of a standard deviation relative to the counter-stereotypical video. So to measure implicit racial stereotyping, I used a measure called the implicit association test, which you may be familiar with. It's a timed computerized classification test, which in this case was adapted to measure respondents' automatic associations between race and academic competence. And so the thing to know about this scale is that a score of 0 on the y-axis here means that the respondent exhibited no automatic racial bias. More positive values indicate that the respondent had stronger implicit associations of white students as being more competent than Black students. So what you can see from looking at the results in this graph here is that on average, respondents in the counter-stereotypical condition on the left here showed significant anti-Black or pro-white bias. But after watching the achievement gap discourse video, respondents held even stronger pro-white or anti-Black implicit racial bias. So there's evidence here that the achievement gap discourse was increasing implicit racial bias. I also found that the achievement gap discourse video increased the level of bias in viewers' education-related stereotypes of Black Americans by 38% of a standard deviation. So after watching the achievement gap video, I gave respondents a survey item where I told them the national high school graduation rate for white students in the US, which is 86%. And I then asked them to give their best guess as to what the national high school graduation rate for Black students was. So here are the results on that item. You see their guesses, average guesses by condition here on the y-axis. And this dotted line here at the top represents the actual national high school graduation rate for Black students in the US at 78%. So one thing that you can see from looking at these results is that all conditions on average dramatically underestimated the high school graduation rate for Black students. You can see that the control Khan Academy video and the counter stereotypical video here had nearly identical graduation rate guesses. But the achievement gap discourse video, after respondents watched that video, they gave significantly lower guesses for the national high school graduation rate for Black students. So in other words, the achievement gap discourse video presenting those differences in proficiency rates led viewers to hold stronger stereotypes of Black Americans as being less educated than white Americans. So the fact that we see these effects on stereotypes of presenting racialized gap statistics raises the question of whether we should shift focus. And scholars such as Richard Milner and many others have argued that we should shift the focus from achievement gaps and looking at differences in proficiency rates on tests and graduation, and instead focus on gaps in opportunities to learn. So opportunity gaps, differences in resources that are given to students from different groups for learning. And these arguments have been having some influence. So a few years ago, recently in the United States here, Teach for America, which is a nonprofit organization that for a long time has said that their mission is to close the achievement gap, has recently announced that they're no longer using this term achievement gap, and they're instead speaking of opportunity gaps. Again, the hope being that by shifting the focus from outcomes to inputs, we can draw attention to structural injustices that may be more productive in terms of actually ending inequality in educational opportunities by race. Prudence Carter and Gary Wellner have made a similar argument in their book, Closing the Opportunity Gap, where they say that we should give more attention to inputs that lead to learning and less attention to the educational outcomes and differences between social groups. But in making this recommendation, they also stress the following. They write, "We do not mean to suggest that measuring outcomes is unimportant or should be halted. As researchers, we consider this information a key component in an evaluative feedback loop, helping policymakers understand which needs are being met and which are not, as well as which policies and practices are most successful." So again, the idea here is about a feedback loop where we're not just tracking differences in educational outcomes between groups, but we're also paying a lot of attention to the inputs and tracking differences in those inputs, but using the differences in the outcomes in order to inform the effectiveness of our efforts. So this raises the question, though, when we are discussing outputs, is there a way of discussing them that may continue to have these negative unintended consequences? And in another study, my co-authors and I set up another set of survey experiments to investigate the effects of the different kinds of language and terms that we use to discuss these inequalities. So in one sample of teachers in the United States, we randomly assigned survey participants to one of two different versions of a survey item here. And so one group of teachers saw a version of the survey item that read, "As you know, there is a racial achievement gap between Black and white students in the US. Thinking about all of the important issues facing the country today, how much of a priority do you think it is to close the racial achievement gap between Black and white students?" And then respondents rated the priority level on this scale here. A second set of teachers were randomly assigned to a different version of this item, where instead of using the term racial achievement gap, they saw the term racial inequality in educational outcomes. And then they were asked the priority level. And so the idea here was that the racial achievement gap language, which has associations with deficit mindsets, may cause teachers to place lower priority level on the issue compared to the language of inequality, which is more more connotes fights for educational or racial justice. And we found that the language used did matter when discussing between group differences and outcomes. So we found that when teachers were shown the term achievement gap, they gave lower priority level to the issue compared to teachers who saw the phrase inequality in educational outcomes. And so on the y-axis here on this plot, you can see the proportion of teachers in the sample who rated the issue as being a high priority or essential. And when the issue was described as an achievement gap, we saw lower reported priority levels from teachers. In a second experiment with a sample of non-teachers, we first replicated that finding that I just showed you, but then added an additional outcome. So we wanted to know whether the language of racial achievement gaps had the effect of magnifying racial stereotypes. And we found evidence that it did. So what you see here on the y-axis is an index of stereotypes where it's comprised of a number of items asking racial stereotypes having to do with work ethic and intelligence. A 0 score on the y-axis here means that the respondent has no racial stereotypes. A more positive value on this y-axis indicates that the respondent had pro-white or anti-black racial stereotypes. And as you can see, when respondents saw the version of the item that described the issue as an achievement gap, they reported higher levels of racial bias compared to respondents who saw the inequality in educational outcome language in their item. So evidence that the language can again exacerbate racial stereotypes. So I'll close here with some key takeaways from these studies. Just reiterating what I said at the top. So when it comes to discourses on racial inequity in education, we saw evidence in these experiments that the framing and the presentation of statistics matter. So when respondents are shown data on racial differences in proficiency rates on standardized tests, that leads them in the immediate term to report larger racial stereotypes on the education stereotype measure as well as on the implicit measure. We also saw evidence that the language that we use when we're discussing these outcomes can make a difference. In particular, the achievement gap language, which has its associations with deficit mindsets, also led respondents to report more negative racial stereotypes and to give less priority to the issue of advancing equity in education. So I'll close here with some reflections from scholars who have given lots of thought to these issues. As I discussed briefly already, when we see these results that there's an effect of the achievement gap discourse on racial stereotypes and priority levels, it raises the question of whether we should turn away from focusing on gaps and outcomes and instead focus on opportunity gaps. Darby and Rory, in their book, The Color of Mind, have argued that we should not ignore educational outcomes, which is an argument that I agree with. So they write that eschewing the concept of achievement or methodical assessments of academic outcomes runs the serious risk of permitting deep-seated assumptions about racial differences in ability to persist or even grow. So, in other words, eschewing the concept of achievement will not eradicate racist stereotypes, and furthermore, using measures of achievement has a role to play in defeating racist stereotypes by guiding efforts to close those gaps. But we still must be thoughtful about how we present these racialized statistics and how we frame the data that we present in order to avoid perpetuating racial stereotypes. So as Ron Ferguson, the leader of the Achievement Gap Initiative at Harvard University, has said, quote, we can do things with the goal of narrowing gaps without dwelling on the gaps in the media. The latter contributes to stereotypes and also discourages the children of color who read the same media reports. So it's important for us to be purposeful and thoughtful about how we present data on racial inequalities and educational outcomes, how we frame those inequalities as being the result of structural injustices, as opposed to being the result of racial differences in potential or academic ability. And we need to be mindful of the audience that we have when we are presenting these statistics and how they're likely to interpret between group differences and outcomes, so that the use of the data is actually productive in advancing equity as opposed to counterproductive. So I'll close there. Thank you for your interest in this work, and I encourage you to reach out for questions or further discussion, and I'll leave here the references for the published versions of this work if you're interested in reading more. Thank you.